Welcome back to the Agger Grand podcast, the show where we talk all the dirt on farming, sustainability, and gardening, and much more. I'm Robert, and I am with my co-host Royce, and today we have the pleasure of having Clay Robinson, aka Dr. Dirt, on our show. Welcome, Clay. It is such a great pleasure to have you here, and we're so excited to talk about dirt. I'd like to start off by kicking it to you and having you just describe what you're about and what you do.
Well, I have a I do have a PhD in soil science that I got at Iowa State University. I have degrees in agriculture, in agronomy, and then in soil science. And not long after I got my PhD, my wife dubbed me uh, Dr. Dirt, and one of those. Well, he's a doctor, but not the kind that'll do you any good. Sort of uh, notations. And then when my kids were young and in school, I was teaching at a university and I was invited to come, talk to classrooms, talk to their classes. And so I started developing this persona of Dr. Dirt. And very early in the web world, our university wanted us to develop web courses, online courses. And so I was got some training on how to put together a web page. And I thought, I think I can take these activities that I'm doing in my intro soils lab and adapt those for kids and uh, and maybe teachers so that kids could do them at home, teachers could do them in classrooms. And one of my colleagues calls the our my approach the Walmart method, and that's if you can't buy it at Walmart, you can't use it for equipment. So it has to be readily available and inexpensive. I've broadened that out to either Lowe's or Home Depot because there's some other things that I occasionally get that are not available at Walmart if I need to build a little something. But all of that led to developing a website, Dr. Dirt's K-12 teaching and outreach activities, and that was how it started. And I just, again, would take things that I was doing in my classroom or in my labs and then adapt them. And sometimes I would take other things and said, how about a sandcastle? Why can you build a sandcastle with wet sand and not dry sand? And it gives a cool opportunity to introduce concepts like physics to
Hmm.
middle school kids. And I've talked to more than 20,000 middle school kids about why soil is important to them and why it's important to take care of it. Oh, that's probably a good start on. And then I was in academia for 24 years, and I've done some other things. We left the last university where I was teaching. I've taught 17 years in the Texas High Plains, and my last five in at Illinois State in Northern Illinois. We came back to the general home region to help take care of aging parents, and so now I dabble in some consulting and still do some outreach kind of activities, developing a soil curriculum, soil steward curriculum for our producers. So that's kind of the big broad spectrum of the things that I do, and uh, and then I dabble in consulting and what I call generally forensic agronomy or forensic soil science, and that's usually when somebody got mad at somebody else and they filed a lawsuit against him, and then a lawyer finds me and says, "Hey, can you can you opine on this?" And so I'm looking at data and pictures and things from soil tests and all sorts of things from 2 to 4 years in the past, and uh, trying to say, all right, this is what happened, or this is what might have happened, this is what didn't happen, um, and then I opine on that. So that's the that's the thumbnail sketch of who I am. It took a little bit more than my elevator speech, but
No, that's great. I mean, you've clearly done so much. It's actually awesome to hear that you are obviously one of the early pioneers of online soil education and getting out outreach for young people. And I mean, it's super inspiring. And I mean,
yeah,
what has
that gave me my own little niche of fame. So there are times when I go out and go to one of our national meetings, and people have been using my materials, and they're like, "You're Dr. Dirt," and and then can I take my picture with you? Oh, sure. Can I use your materials? Absolutely. I mean, that's why they're out there. Um, because every soil has a story, and it needs a storyteller. With all of my experience, I've looked at soil in more than 25 states and four different countries. And so I know a lot about things that are going on, how soil forms, what the things that are working on it, that are causing it to be what it is, and that are causing it to either improve in its condition or degrade based on human management practices, or sometimes, uh, although there are certain people that don't want to admit it, but a changing climate um, is making some big challenges for certain soils in certain regions.
You said that every soil has a story. Could you tell us about some of the more interesting soils that you've looked at? In particular, like what's your favorite soil?
Well, uh, to start that story, we have an acronym CLORPT, uh, and there are five factors that are involved in a soil forming. That's climate, the CL, organisms, and the dominant organisms in general are going to be the plants, the vegetation that's growing on the top, because you've got the roots that are growing in the soil. And so, for instance, grass roots, fibrous root systems develop a very different soil than tree roots. And so forested soils are very different than grassland soils. And generally, uh, because of the way the root systems of those plants work. And then relief, and that's not just topography. Topography is the shape of the landscape. Relief talks about where the soil is forming on the slope. So is it up on the top? Is it on a shoulder? Uh, on a slope, down at the bottom, in a foot slope or toe slope? Is it in a floodplain? So those factors are going to affect how the soil forms. And then what's it forming in, the parent material? Those can make big differences. A soil that's forming in a volcanic uh, ash or tuff is going to be very different than one that's forming in limestone that's weathering. It's going to be very different from one that's forming in parent materials that have been moved and deposited by lakes or rivers or wind. And so, and then time, how long has it been there? Uh, the longer the soil that landscape is stable, the more time that soil has to form. And so, what's my favorite? Well, I've spent most of my career in dry and drier places, so I really do enjoy uh, these short grass prairie mollisols that have shrink swell properties. So when we get droughts, and what happens in these shrink swell properties are due to certain types of clays. We call them high activity clays, but when they dry, they lose water. And when they get wet, they swell because they're gaining water, but not just on the outside, which is why most soil particles just adsorb water onto the outside of the particle. So if you've got a sand, where's the water going to be? It's going to be in the pores between the particles and in a little thin film around the particle itself. If you've got a silt particle, well, again, silt particles, where's the water going to be? In those little tiny capillary pores between the particles and in a film around the particle itself. And then in certain types of clays, it's going to be the same story. But these shrink swell clays, they think of them sort of like an accordion and a stack of paper. So on these other materials, these other types of minerals, all you see is the outside edge of that stack of paper. But in these shrink swell clays, every one of those little sheets inside, water can move in, and then think about it as an accordion, and it expands as water moves into those sheets between, so in the layers between the individual clay particles. They're like, uh, again, they're these kinds of clays are plate-like, so they
Hmm.
just get formed, and the chemistry of those they form in thin sheets, and then those sheets just start stacking on top of each other, and shrink swell clays absorb water between those, and so some of those can absorb as much as 3 to 5 times their weight in water, and then they can expand as much again as much as 5 times, and sometimes more, which those cause all sorts of challenges for construction and roads. So they're not great for that, but I really just enjoy them. I've walked out onto one of those after a long dry period, and uh, I stuck my foot in the crack down to the middle of my shin, and then I had a 4 foot long, really heavy duty. We call them sharpshooters or drain spades is what they'll call them in other places. And I held that down into the hole up to about the middle of my forearm. And then I had a 6 foot soil probe. It's just a little skinny metal thing that I held down there. I never touched the bottom. So the longer the crack, the longer the spell is, the drier it is, deeper it dries, and the wider the crack gets. So I like those. Those to me are really fun uh, soils. Now, weird soils to me anyway. Organic soils, things that you might find in bogs or peat, those can you start trying to touch them when they're dominantly often can be up to 70-90% organic matter material. They're slimy when they're wet. And you walk out on the bog and you can bounce on it. Now, I had a chance last winter or last summer to go on an Arctic soils tour. And so we started in Anchorage and we went all the way up to Point Barrow, so on the very north, just north to south through the state. Looked at a lot of different soils. Um, they have some crazy things that go on there because as water uh, water accumulates, then and it freezes and more water accumulates, it starts to build things up called a frost boil. Now, you folks in the Northeast might have similar things that cause your sidewalks to buckle. Uh, the Because the water goes in, it freezes, and freezing is actually a unique case of drying, and water will move from soil that has moisture in it to that place next to the ice, and so then more ice forms and more ice forms and more, and it just gets thicker and thicker. We call those ice lenses when you find them in the soil. And so those soils were kind of unique too when you dig a hole and there's a layer of ice in the soil because it's permafrost. The So those are probably two of the one of my favorites and one of the weirdest soils that I've encountered.
You actually touched on something there that I've seen before. I'm involved in the construction industry, and during like the fall when we're digging big holes in the ground, like the next morning, I'm going to come back and I see that inside this big hole, like along the sides, I see ribbons of ice coming out of it.
Mhm.
It comes out of the side of the hole and it starts growing this little icicle sideways, and there's just ribbons coming into the hole. I find that so interesting. And so that's water moving through the soil. It's
Yes, and water can move in multiple directions. So again, I spent most of my career in dry and drier places. I took a group of college students. We have soil judging contests, and so what they do is they learn how to read part of the soil story. We dig a pit, and you look at that vertical cross section, much like what you're seeing that you're describing when you come back in the next morning and you look at that. And we look at the horizons or the layers, and each of those layers tells me something about that soil. And I would, I had the same experience. I'm from this area. I went to Iowa State University and was taking a class in soil physics, and they were talking about water tables and how water moves in soil. I was also, I think it was the same time I was taking a civil engineering soil engineering course, and they were talking about water tables, and I had no frame of reference for a water table. And one day I was riding my bike I lived in student housing, went underneath the railroad track going to campus, and there was water running across the sidewalk.
Hmm.
And the only time water runs across the sidewalk in my experience before I got there was when somebody was watering their lawn and they left the water on. Uh, so I started looking around and I realized there was a water table. And what's happening is the water is moving laterally out of that soil, running across the sidewalk because the level of the water in the soil, the water table, is higher than the level uh, of that sidewalk and that road. Now, years later, I took a group of students to Illinois, and these guys go down in a pit, and they have to put a pallet down in the pit because there's water in the bottom of the soil pit. And so that's weird to them to start with. But we have rain, and rain runs into things. And so from their perspective, well, water just ran into the pit. And so one of my students, standing down in the pit, we'd use knives to pick stuff off. And so he'd go into a spot up here and he'd pick it and he'd pull off what we call an aggregate, that chunk that a lot of people call clods. Um, Soil scientists call them aggregates or even PEDs. But he'd pick it off and look, and he'd drop down about 6 inches and he'd pick it off and he'd look. And what happened at the bottom, in that lower one, is he'd pick it off and immediately it kind of looked a lot like the one above. But given about 10 or 15 seconds, the surface would start to shine, because the water was moving laterally through the soil, like you had with your icicles forming on the soil, on the soil side of the soil pit. It was moving out to that point, and so you can identify the depth of a water table in that case.
Hmm.
And then the other thing, that one of the parts of the soil story, that water table is not at the same height all year round. Usually it's going to be higher in most places in the spring, um, coming out of the winter. And then you have all these crops and plants that start growing and it gets hotter. And so they're using more water from the soil and the water table drops. And then it you get winter time and it's colder and the water table goes up again. And so it goes through this up and down process. Now, you may be at a point where it's always below a water table. But if you take me to one of those pits, one of the stories that I can tell you is the story of the height of the water table in that soil.
Hmm.
Why? Because the soil colors are different. When something lives underneath the water all the time, it becomes reduced, and reduced iron are going to be gray and dull colors. But if something's up on the top where it gets plenty of oxygen, well, if it's been wet and then it has oxygen happen to it, think about, I don't know, you go out and you find an old nail, or you dig up something and it's an old piece of metal and it's rusted. Well, what's happened? The water got on it, and the chemistry happened, and it oxidized that iron that was reduced, that made that nail the color that it was to start with. And so the same thing can happen in soil. You change the chemistry, an oxidation reaction, and so bright colors are above our water table, dull colors below. And if you see a mixture of colors, that's where the water table is going up and down. So
Hmm.
it's always at some level, and it gets as high as another level, and it stays long enough to cause things to reduce, and then the water goes back down, uh, oxygen comes back in, and it oxidizes. Now, the coolest aggregate that I've got, and if you go to my website, uh, drdirt.org, the aggregate that I have on the front page, I said, what's the story of this soil? Well, I found this aggregate down at about 5 feet in a soil pit, and it's got black soil in it. It's got gray on the outside, and then it's got this layer of orange. Like, what in the world is happening there? It was a crawdad burrow. So the crawdad came down from the top, left a hole. So what's going to go down the hole? The soil that he brought down with him, which is a Illinois, really rich, dark topsoil, high organic matter. That came down. But the other thing that comes in is oxygen. So he lives below the water table. And so that causes the soil down there to be really gray. He digs the hole and you get a rainfall event and the black soil washes into the hole. But then the oxygen comes in and the oxygen causes that soil to rust, if you will, to oxidize, and so it turns orange. So crazy combination of colors you find. It's part of the story.
And this is happening like everywhere. I mean, which is mind-blowing. Like literally like everywhere in the world at every moment the soils are going through these like shifts and I mean, I think it's like I think when I read on your website, it was really altering to like think about how water moving through the soil actually like the soil will filter the water, but it'll also change and create these chemical reactions like you were mentioning. And I mean, that kind of makes me think like when the water goes down with the water table, like say the water table gets like messed up completely and maybe it's like lowered more or like just taken out completely. How much will that affect the soil in that area?
What it's gonna, the first thing it affects is plant growth. Uh, if you're a good field soil scientist, you need to be a little bit of ecologist too.
Mm-hmm.
So need to understand a little bit about plant ecology because when you walk across the soil surface, the land surface, I can tell you part of the story when I get near one of those places where the water table is really close to the surface, an area, a wetland, because wetlands have certain kind of plants that grow in them. And there are certain kind of plants that always grow in the water. Now, the ones that people are most familiar with are things like cattails uh, and maybe some reeds. But there's also some plants that we call them facultative. What that means is they can grow in the with uh, a flooded root zone, and so there's water down there. But they've got special adaptations to take oxygen down into their roots, and so they can exist in those areas where the water comes up to the surface and it kind of becomes anaerobic in the system, but they can also exist when the water table goes back down. So plants are the first things that are affected by by a change in the depth of the water table. Now, has that happened? Yeah, that's happening. Uh, Precipitation patterns are changing, shifting, and that that causes changes in the water tables. Um, Other things that are happening that cause changes in the depths of the water table. I saw an article recently that all the major cities are sinking.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's that the what happens there generally is that you have a really old soil at some point, or maybe it's just a deposit of materials, and water was deposited in the pores. And there's a positive pressure in those pores often. So it kind of holds the things in place. It's in an equilibrium. Well, people need water. So what do? They drill a well. And so what's a well? It's a straw. It pulls the water out. And when you pull enough of the water out, that positive pressure that was holding the soil particles apart goes negative, And so the soil particles come closer together, and so and then you start losing height. The
Mm.
soil starts to shrink, and the buildings start to settle. That's worse when the thing is on an old lake bed, like Mexico City. A lot of the buildings in Mexico City are sinking because they built it on an ancient lake bed, and then they started pulling the water out. And silts aren't very good at hold. They don't have a lot of uh, rigidity. And if you're doing some construction work there, Royce, you might understand something about that. Sands have a lot of strength. Silts don't. Clays have less. Uh, and but then you take the water out from between the particles, and the buildings start to settle. And most people are familiar with the Tower of Pisa. Well, why did it lean? It was built on an old lake bed, and so as water, it's got enough weight that it started pushing water out, but it didn't push water out equally. So it started to lean because the water came out of one side more than the other, and then you've changed uh, you've shifted the weight distribution. And so now that one side that's leaning down a little further is putting even more force on it. And so it's forcing more water out and causing it to compress even more. So
Mm.
that's those are a couple of things that are going on there when you can change the vegetative community, and you have issues associated with construction, because when you get rid of the water table, if it's been there, it changes the physics of what's happening in the soil.
So we have soil physics to thank for one of the great attractions of the world.
Yeah, yes. Well, and soil physics is also the reason that you can make soil sand castles. Uh,
Mm.
the Because two physical properties are responsible for sand castles. If you have dry sand and you pour it out, you just get a mound. The only force at work there uh, is friction, rough particles bouncing against each other and bridging each other, and they kind of form a mound. Now to play with it, uh, get different sizes of sand, or get some cornmeal and then some flour and some uh, powdered sugar, and put them in a mound and watch. The shape of the mound is different, and it gets steeper as the particle sizes get smaller. But now
Mm.
back to sand. But friction's the only thing at work. So now you get it wet though, and you've added two more forces. One of them that we talked about earlier, that is didn't use the word, but said the water exists in a shell, a little thin film around the outside of a particle. The word that's responsible for that uh, is adhesion. Now, you may have used an adhesive bandage. Well, it sticks to something that's not like it. That's what the idea of adhesion is. And so water sticks to things that are not like it, soil particles. And in this case, talking about sandcastles, sand. Well, water is also really egotistical, and it likes to hold on to itself. And so those water molecules are pulling on each other. And when there's a sand grain there, the water on the sand grain is pulling on the water on the other sand grain. And so they form little bridges between the particles, and they hold the sandcastle together due to these combination of adhesion of water for soil particles and cohesion of water molecules for other water molecules.
Mm.
And that works until you get too much water. And so those form a negative pressure. It's like every one of those little spaces between those sand particles is a capillary. Um, and so it forms kind of a negative pressure, a suction that holds those particles together. But when you add too much water, you change that from a negative to a positive force inside the particles, then they just fall apart. Uh,
Wow.
and so that's why when the water comes in, your sandcastle at the beach, your sandcastle starts to fall apart. Uh,
Um, I mean that yeah, that's like mind blowing, honestly, like when you think of it breaking it down like that. Um,
Man, I think soil is such an interesting field of study, and I didn't study it in college. It was just after college. I just stumbled upon it, and it was just like the sexiest thing ever to study because once you start looking at like the soil nutrient levels, that's what I had started with. Like,
Hmm.
what's the percent of calcium in there? What's the total exchange capacity? Things like that. But then you start reading about, okay, I have to understand chemistry, and then you look at the texture and you have to understand physics. And then you have to think about, well, maybe quantum physics even. And there's just so much to go on.
Well,
I feel
uh,
like it's just not understandable for one human brain.
yeah.
What's your take on that, Clay?
Well, students hated taking soil science classes, if the, because, and what I would tell kids in my discussions with them is that a soil scientist is an applied scientist. And so, as you noted, Royce, there's a lot of stuff there. So there's chemistry involved, there's physics. So when I'm talking to kids, chemistry is how things are made, physics are how things are worked, biology, need to know because how things live and grow, because there's all sorts of, there's more organisms in a handful of soil than there are people on the planet, at least in most areas. Deserts, that doesn't hold true. But and then it works. It helps to know something about ecology. Um, some of my colleagues are really into geology and geoscience. Hydrology, I mentioned hydrology, talking about how this water moves in the soil. So yeah, there's all sorts of things there. And well, and then you got to know a little bit of math. And that was also distressing to people because you've got, you're working with math and physics and in chemistry. And so it is a complex science. And it's different from other things because if you take calcium and you take carbonates, so you've got a divalent cation, it's got two positive charges on the calcium, and you take a carbonate that has two negative charges and you put them together, they're always gonna hook up and make calcium carbonate. Every time that's going to happen. You drop a ball, every time it's going to fall. So there are things in the physical world, in physics and in chemistry, that always act the same way every time. But soil doesn't work that way. That's why, and so soil, that's one of the things that makes soil much harder to work with. Even if you add the same amount of water to the soil, dry it down, and wet it up again, it may not hold water in the same way or even be able to hold the same amount of water because just the act of water moving into the soil drying, getting wet again, that changes things in the soil, especially if it's one of these clays that I mentioned earlier that has some shrink swell properties. Um, yeah, so soil can be as easy or as hard as well, it's always got a little bit of challenge to it. But so most of my colleagues, what they would do is they'll focus. They'll be a soil chemist or a soil physicist. I had soil chemistry classes, I had soil physics classes, soil biologist, microbiologist, had get to plate things out and see what's growing in the soil and um, what's living in there. And there's all sorts of crazy stuff that lives in there. There are fungi that are their whole evolution is to capture nematodes. And there's even three different ways that the fungi, different types of fungi have evolved to capture a nematode. So you look at stuff like that, that's just mind-boggling. Uh, but that's, learn that in my soil biology class, soil chemistry, so people pick generally a discipline. I picked soil management when I was doing my PhD because I was more interested in what happens to the soil when when we work with it. When we plow it, when we grow things in it, when we add fertilizer to it, when we put manure or compost on it, when we do the same thing to it for decades. So long term, what can happen to the soil? And so that's a different nature of the soil story. Uh, and so that's where I chose, and I became what I prefer is uh, field soil science, going out and doing stuff, seeing stuff, touching it, looking at it. Now, collecting samples and then sending them to a lab, absolutely. But I don't want to be the one in the lab doing the work. That's not the kind of guy that I am. That's not where I find the fun in the science. But I've got friends that's their niche. That's what drives them.
Mm. Maybe you could tell us about some of your early work, about how the chemicals in the soil, the elements affect, how much nutrients enter the actual plants. Like how are they sucking up that calcium and magnesium that then, people can eat and animals can eat.
But
I'm really interested in hearing about that.
the take you back through some history. It took people a long time to figure out what the element of growth was in plants. Um, they had no idea it was the air. Had no idea that they were getting carbon dioxide from the air and converting that into that big tree or that grass or whatever they were looking at. And and it took a long time for them to figure that out. And then it was water, because again, we didn't understand the chemistry that, well, water is just H2O. It doesn't have but they knew that you had to water a plant and that the plants used water. So the first time, and then, well, soil. There was a guy, Jethro Tull, and now I don't remember which century. I think it was in the 1500s or early 1600s. Um, he wrote a book, Horse Hoeing Husbandry. And the idea that they had at that point was that the plant roots were eating the soil particles. And that was what was generating the ability of the plant to take in its nutrition. And so the idea that they had, and his wording was like you had to beat the soil up and pulverize it to make the pabulum. So pabulum, you start getting the idea of baby food, right? You take a banana and you smash it all up. And so that was kind of the idea of pulverizing the soil to because they thought the roots were eating those soil particles. So they had to make the soil particles small enough to do that. It wasn't until a guy, don't remember his name now, but they're trying to figure out what is the element of growth. And so he put a tree, planted a sapling in a big vat of soil, probably something that would think maybe on the order of a 55-gallon drum cut in half, something like that. Filled it with soil and then put the tree in it. And he waited when he put the soil in. And then at some period in time later, took the tree out, weighed the tree, washed all the soil off the roots, weighed the tree, and then weighed the soil again. There was not a big difference, not nearly as much difference in the weight. So, like, what's happening here? And they realized then that it had to be the air, that they was getting carbon dioxide from the air. So your question about plants and nutrients. Well, there are 17 essential nutrients. Three of those plants get from air and water. So we get carbon dioxide and water, or oxygen and hydrogen. Plants get those from air and water. So then that leaves us 14 that the plants get from the soil. Some of those plants need in larger amounts. And again, using some acronyms, uh, some fun ones. You have C. Hopkins Cafe Mighty Good. Uh, the CHO, we already know carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, those belong to this, get them from the air and water. But now that leads us to the nutrients that the plant is getting from the soil. So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, iron, and sulfur. Those plants need in larger amounts. Uh, and even among those, but we're talking now on the order of, I like to talk in metric, but most people don't if they're in this country. I even have a booklet from 1962, no, 1970, why the metric system is better and why the U.S. is going to be in all on the metric system. Um, it didn't happen. Uh, we have similar things. We had some constituent complained, and politicians tend to be often spineless. They won't stand up for something if there's too much, if they think they won't get reelected. So anyway, these are things that are needed on the order of a few pounds up to 100 pounds or more per acre. So, and in most plants, nitrogen is the next biggest one that they need. Why? Well, nitrogen is in every protein. And so every amino acid, every protein has nitrogen in it. The phosphorus is next. Well, phosphorus, and so now we're talking about things that do similar things in your body as they do in plants. Amino acids that make proteins, and then, you got uh, new you've got nucleic acids, RNA, DNA. Plants have all those. The energy systems in plants use phosphorus, and so you start working through all these things that do similar things in plants as in humans. Potassium, big thing for potassium, just like in humans, is electrolyte balance. And so keeping your cells in plants, they keep your plant from wilting.
Hmm.
And then we just keep going down the list: calcium, magnesium, sulfur. Sulfur is another one of those involved in amino acids. Calcium is involved in cell walls in plants, bones in humans, teeth. Uh, Magnesium in plants is involved in one of the components with nitrogen in certain parts of chlorophyll, as is iron, so that you can have green leaves that can convert carbon dioxide to sugars, simple sugars. And then you get down to the micronutrients. Uh, use for that one, I use another acronym. It's Be Mine Cousin Monocle. So you have to think of a hillbilly Valentine. Uh, so you got boron, manganese, copper, zinc, and those metals that we have there, they exist. They have different valence states, and so they're involved in that trickle down that happens as in the chlorophyll that plant captures a photon of energy, and it trickles down through a set of electrons being transferred along those metals until it captures it and it puts it on a carbon. Uh,
Hmm.
and so, but that you got those metals then, and then molybdenum, nickel. Most things, nickel is needed in super small amounts. It's the last one that we added in realizing that it was a micronutrient. Just figured that out in roughly, well, in the 2000s. Um, and then chloride. Chloride's another one that's involved in a lot of electrolyte balance, and it also really helps improve plant health. So now then, you get all these elements. Some of those and they're all charged. They're either an anion with a negative charge or a cation with a positive charge. I told you that some of those can have different levels of charge. Nitrogen is the craziest one because it can have a +3 a +5, or a -3 for its charge. So uh, things that are going on in decomposition, there are organisms in the soil that are just involved in converting one form of nitrogen in the soil, like ammonia or ammonium, into nitrate and then nitrite. Special organisms do one of those processes, and another group of organisms do the other. So now we've got biochemistry happening in those cycles. But back to the soil. Sands are essentially inert. Silts are essentially inert. So if you want a soil that can hold nutrients, you were talking about its exchange capacity. Talk about it as a cation exchange capacity. You got to have some clay in there, and different kinds of clay have different amounts of exchange capacity. The other thing that will hold on to nutrients is organic matter. So humus is what a lot of people will call that one outside of the uh, soil carbon compounds.
Hmm.
So what determines your nutrient holding capacity of your soil? The type of clay, the amount of clay, and the amount of organic matter. Now, how do the plants get those nutrients? So they're in the soil. Well, for the most part, the water in the soil is never pure. It's always in a solution. So all those things, all those uh, elements, atoms, compounds that are in the soil, they exist in some sort of equilibrium with the water in the soil in between those particles. So I'm going to refer to it as the soil solution at this point. In physics, you talk about the soil water. In chemistry and fertility, you talked about the soil solution. So the and they're in some sort of equilibrium with what's present on soil particles and what's present in that soil solution. And as you take something out of the soil solution, something on a soil particle can move into the solution to take its place. Now, the plant mentioned earlier is a little bit like well, I said a well was like a straw. So a plant root is also like a straw. So uh, the and this is driven by gradients of talk about them as potential energy in soil science stuff, but the air is drier than the cells inside the plant is uh, often drier than what's in the soil. And so you have plants losing water through the leaves. And so where are they going to replace that? Well, they're going to get that water from the soil. So they start sucking water up. So it's like a sponge, like a straw. They suck water up from the soil, goes through the plant up into the air. Transpiration. Well, what happens next? Anything that's in that soil solution, almost anything that's in the soil solution, when the plant sucks up that water, those ions go into the plant with it. So plants can even take up elements or compounds in the soil that they don't need just because it's there. And when they're sucking the water up, that's generally a non-selective process. There are some elements that it takes some energy because they can't on their own. They can get in those spaces in between cells, but they can't get into a soil cell without some energy expenditure. Potassium is one of those. Another way, used to think a whole lot more of it, but as the root grows through the soil and a root hair touches a soil particle that has a nutrient in it or touches a nutrient, then there's a potential maybe for uh, just contact touch. Now, the other thing that you may have heard about, there's a lot of discussion about certain types of fungi called mycorrhizae. And mycorrhizae, fungi have something called hyphae. Now, hyphae, you can think about them in generic terms, sort of like roots, because the hyphae extend out into the soil, just like roots do, and they can capture nutrients. And then there are two types of mycorrhizae that actually want to bring the nutrients that they capture in those hyphae back to a central location. And when those when those mycorrhizae form on a plant root and they explore, what they in essence do is increase the volume of the soil that the plant can explore for nutrients and water, because the hyphae, mycorrhizae, form on the outside of the plant roots, sometimes on the inside of the plant roots, and then they send out their little guys, and so they form on a root hair, and so the plant only has so many root hairs. But now then you build a mycorrhizal structure on the outside of it that reaches out into the soil and can capture a whole lot more nutrients and bring them back in. So there's been research, and particularly it started in Russia where they did a lot of work with it, showing that you can increase the amount of phosphorus that the plants can access from the soil and water due to these infections. Really, that's what it is. The fungi infects the plant, but it just happens to, in this case, be a beneficial relationship. So that's some of the ways that nutrients get into plants. That's the nutrients that plants need. That's then one other thought there. How do you know if a plant is lacking in a nutrient? Do you even know that? How do you tell if your plant wants something that it doesn't have?
I would typically say just by looking at the color of the leaves.
Excellent. Uh, so if my plant is yellow, Robert, I'll see how much you know here. If my plant is yellow, what is it likely deficient in?
I would say maybe phosphorus.
Now, phosphorus tends to make you get blue, get purples, kind of reddish purples if it's deficient in phosphorus.
Yeah, I should know this because my
How about
pursuing
you,
treatise
Royce?
is yellowing.
Well, it depends where the yellow is on the leaf. If it's the whole leaf,
Ah,
it's probably nitrogen. If it's in between like the veins of the leaf, it's probably magnesium. If it's spots of yellow, it's probably calcium. I
okay.
was
You got two out of three there.
Nice.
It's it's uh, it's probably iron. Iron is the one that creates the interveinal chlorosis. Zinc, if sometimes those straps, instead of being yellow, they'll tend to be white. Um,
Hmm.
and iron iron deficiencies show up on newer leaves uh, before older leaves. Nitrogen deficiencies show up in older leaves because the plant can take where's the nitrogen? Well, it's in proteins and things like that that are in the leaves. And the plant can actually then transport nitrogen from leaves at the bottom, take it out of those and export it to the new growth, because that's where all the stuff is happening, where it needs all those new nutrients and energy to work through things. But iron, once it's in a compound in a plant like chlorophyll, it can't it can't be taken out of that. So then
Hmm.
iron deficiencies tend to show up at the top of a plant or in the new growth. Um, there's all sorts of things, a whole series of things that you can go through on figuring out. So there are some visual symptoms that you can use to identify, well, is my plant deficient in something? Now, how do you decide how much nutrient? I'm always going to tell you, if you want to make a good fertilizer application, get a soil test. And that's where I'm going to start with that. If you're working with your lawn and you've got turf, which I tend to hate, you probably don't. I just did a whole lot of mowing, 3 hours today. We took a couple of hours earlier this week, and yeah, it's a huge lawn. It was my father-in-law's place, I I trying to get, put some native, let some native plants grow, uh, leave some things out there where we don't have to mow quite as much. Um, but a lawn generally doesn't need much. It might need a little bit of nitrogen if you haul off your grass clippings.
Mhm.
Because if you have a closed system, you mow and you leave the grass clippings out there, you're not exporting any nutrients. But if you mow and you haul off all those grass clippings, they're green. Nitrogen's one of those things that's making them green. So if you remove your grass clippings, you are taking nutrients off, and you may need to add some nitrogen back. Um, but I'm always going to recommend taking a soil sample and sending it off to a lab for analysis. The little soil test kits you can buy, um, I won't list any brand names, but they're they're helpful, but they're not accurate.
Mhm.
They can give you some information, but you can't really go full bore on figuring out, well, I need this much. It'll tell you if you need nitrogen. It won't tell you how much you'd need. How do you know those? Well, the soil test work has been done for generations now, where they take soil test, they grow a plant or crop, and they put different amounts of fertilizer on them, and they look at how the plant responded to different amounts of fertilizer when it started at uh, a certain soil test value. That stuff has been going on now again for generations since they started that kind of work in the 40s. So there's a lot of work to support that. But they're anyway. Now, quick on compost. I mentioned compost. If you're going to use compost, it needs to be mature. If you use an immature compost, you can actually induce a nitrogen deficiency
Mhm.
because the organisms need nitrogen in order to decompose. So greens and browns are what sometimes people will talk about for making compost. Browns are those carbon compounds and need the right balance of greens and browns to get that to happen. If you still got too many browns, you can run out of nitrogen, and the organisms can use nitrogen more readily and easier than your plant can get access to it. Um, and long term, I've seen this long term application of compost. It's an excellent phosphorus source and other micronutrients. It's not a great place to get nitrogen. Um, some great master or gardener was, you know, taking care of their soil, and they were only using organic stuff, and they were adding compost and compost and compost. Their phosphorus level in their soil built up so much that it induced a zinc deficiency. So things you have to watch for, even when you're trying to do all the right stuff, you got to keep the balance. And so again, that's a place where soil testing is good because it can help you figure out where you are and if you're likely to induce some sort of a deficiency because nutrients have interactions. Some of them synergistic and some of them antagonistic, and zinc and phosphorus are to have an antagonistic relationship.
Kind of going off of like what how important soil testing is and partly why I even guessed potassium. So when I have a persimmon tree and it was clearly showing signs of a little struggling. The leaves were kind of crinkling and
Hmm.
turning a little yellow. So I've done soil testing in my yard, obviously. And so before even looking at that, I was just like trying to diagnose the symptoms on the internet and figure out like, okay, like what's going on here. And I actually saw like people mentioning like it could be an iron deficiency. So without really thinking of it, I bought a I think like a chelate of like iron
Right.
for like the fertilizer. But
Hmm.
then I just had this like thought like, like soil testing's great. I obviously done a lot of soil testing, so I looked at my soil test to see like is this really like what could be deficient? And I found out I actually have plenty of iron. I don't think that was the issue. So I returned the iron chelate, and I think it was potassiums actually that I'm deficient in, and nitrogen, potassium and nitrogen. So I looking to get sulfate of potash, and then also
Right.
I added a nitrogen um, fertilizer, and it has helped my persimmon.
Yeah. The yeah, potassium a lot of times is involved in those crinkling things that you
Okay,
see in
yeah.
a leaf. Um,
Hmm.
now, um, I had a random thought there that may have escaped as you were talking about that. Um, oh, yeah, if you're pH, I wanted to talk a bit about soil pH. Soil pH is one of the primary importance of soil pH is nutrient availability. So certain nutrients are more available in alkaline soils, higher pH soils, other nutrients more available in lower pH soils, acidic soils. And so the nutrients that are more available in alkaline soils are less available in acidic soils and vice versa. So I live in a place, our pHs tend to run 7.2 up to about 8.3. And so our soils have lots of total iron in them. It's just not available because the pH is too high and the iron gets kinky with the carbonates and it forms, then it precipitates out in these insoluble iron compounds. So the iron's there. We got really red soils. The iron's there. It's just not in a form that's available to the plants. Now we can have sometimes 15 or 20,000 parts per million calcium too. So that can cause some challenges. But in your, if your soil tends to be more acid, well, what else is calcium and magnesium and sometimes potassium can be are limiting in acidic soils. And one reason people will add limestone, ag lime, or is to raise the pH to that magic range of maybe about 6.5 to 7 or so, because that's the range where most nutrients are most available. And so if you get below that range, calcium, magnesium, potassium become less available. If you get above that range, your micronutrient metals, iron, zinc, copper, uh, manganese, they become more limiting. So there's a sweet spot, and that's what why pH is important. So when you're looking at a soil test, that's the other thing to consider. Royce, you mentioned Northeast, so you've got acidic soils. Where are you, Robert?
Likewise, Northeast. So
Okay,
my
so you
soil,
guys
all
are
my
working
soil
with,
test is also acidic. So
yeah, all you guys are dealing with are acidic soils, and so potentially adding adding some lime to your soil occasionally would improve nutrient availability, possibly.
yeah, I think for my lawn in particular, I have added lime before to try to raise my pH because as I mentioned it was a little acidic. But I think I have too much calcium anyway in my soil. Like I have a lot of calcium. So I think that was why I was afraid to add lime or going forward to keep adding lime. Do you have any recommendations for that?
Well, that's one where I'd have to look at the soil test results and think through those.
Do you want to take a look
It,
at my soil test?
the if you have calcium, uh, the chemistry of what goes on with calcium in the soil takes hydrogens out of play. So what it does is it'll take that hydrogen and you end up with a water molecule. So you add the calcium and you take out two hydrogens. The so if you've got an acidic soil and you've got a lot of calcium, there's something else happening. Uh, and and it could be that you've got enough of some of those metals because iron, manganese, copper, and zinc are all there. Calcium when you add it to a soil, it causes the pH to go up. Those metals that I just listed, when you add those to the soil, it causes the pH to go down. So we call them acidic cations. Um, and sulfur. Sulfur is another thing. If you added sulfur to a soil, just elemental sulfur, it's the most effective acidifying agent that we have. Um, the so yeah, I'd have to ponder that and look at it because what do what's your how much calcium do you have? I'll ask that one. You
You
know,
know what? I'm going to do something even better. I'm going to pull up my soil test.
Absolutely that'll work. While he's doing that, Royce, do you have any other thoughts or questions or
I have a ton of questions. Every statement that you go over here, I have like three like offshoot conversations that we could get on. Maybe I could just note my situation because it's kind of a particular one. I live in like a floodplain of the Susquehanna River, in Northeast Pennsylvania. And my soil seems very sandy, very silty. I haven't like tested that, but that's just what it seems. Water drains through it really quick. My total exchange capacity is fairly low. I think it's like 10 or something like that. Soil test data indicates that I think it's 90% saturated with calcium. So I've been applying sulfur recently, and I think I had adjusted some other micronutrients.
so
However,
what's your pH?
oh, gosh, I think my pH was a bit high. I think it was close
Okay.
to.
So what's happening there? I talked about parent materials,
Mhm.
right? Uh, that floodplain, it's traveling through some limestone rock. And so there's some weathered limestone somewhere upriver from where you are that is contributing all that calcium. And so the parent material, now what you're working in now, you've got a transported deposited parent material, but somewhere back upstream, uh, there was some limestone that weathered, and that's where the calcium came from. Um,
That's extremely interesting. Yeah, so like my soil, whenever you dig down there, even if you dig like 10 feet, I've seen new homes being built nearby, and I looked at those excavation sites, and it is the same looking dirt the entire way down. I find it very interesting. It's a bunch of like,
okay.
very small, like pebbles, basically, that have been weathered, just by rivers. And I think I
Well,
like the 100-year floodplain.
the so quick thing on rivers and water transporting materials. I talk we say that water is a sorting agent. And so it will uh what you end up with uh water transported deposited materials from rivers and streams particularly is stratification, either sometimes both horizontal. So if you think you're walking through a stream and you notice the big rocks are in the middle.
Mhm.
And as you go out, because that's where the water runs fastest, as you go out toward the edges, the water gets shallower. It doesn't run as fast, and the rocks and the pebbles and things get smaller, and then you get sands on the outsides. And if you get one of those areas, a little pond where the water doesn't move at all, that's where you get your silts and clays that'll build up. Um, and then also because the water doesn't flow at the same rate all the time, it's not uncommon to get little beds of uh, alternating silts, sands, gravel, clay, silt, just and maybe there's not a big variation in the particle sizes, but you can often see in floodplains uh, a stratification that when you dig a hole, you can tell that the water was flowing at a different rate because different sizes of particles were deposited.
Man, I need to find a hole nearby so I could check this out. If I ever see a new home going in, I'm gonna just walk over there and see if I can jump down in there and get a nice picture of it because I would love to see that.
Yeah. All right, here we go.
Can you see my soil test?
Yeah,
I could see it.
I
Perfect.
got it there. I'm looking. Yeah, you got a probably fairly sandy or silty soil because you've got only your cation exchange capacity is just about 9. really acidic, you need some lime, dude. And you're looking at that, and it says that you're still a little low on what it thinks on your, even though you've got 2,300, it says it would like you to have 2,400. So when you look down, I think you were probably looking at your base saturation,
Hmm.
where it says 60 to 70% calcium. That's not the place to decide where you are, because calcium in a lot of soils is going to uh, be the dominant element there. Uh, yeah. So you definitely need some lime. You need to bring that pH
Okay.
up.
Yeah, I mean, I have a whole bucket of it, so I guess
And well,
I
and the thing
guess
about lime is it's not a one-time only offer. Uh, why is your soil, why does your soil not have a lot of calcium in it? Calcium is soluble and it moves. And so you're in a place, you get a lot of rainfall, the water moves through your soil relatively easily, and it carries calcium with it, carries magnesium with it, those basic cations. So it takes those out, and that's why the pH goes down. Now, the other thing that you've got a concern with, I'm looking potentially, especially with your pH that low, um, I'd be concerned with aluminum toxicity.
yes.
Um, Anytime you're below 5.5, aluminum can become toxic to plants. And so that might have been something else that was going on with your tree. You may have actually had some aluminum toxicity going on. So yeah, 5.9, you're in the potential danger area there. Keep track of that. Keep watch
Okay.
on that one.
I definitely did have an idea of that. I guess so you're saying that my calcium though is fine.
Well, I want you to notice it says deficit. What it's
Hmm.
telling you is they think you need some lime, some calcium, because lime is calcium carbonate. And so they think it would be beneficial for you to add some lime.
Would you agree with that though? Just because
Absolutely.
God, perfect.
Because again, most nutrients are most available when you get up towards 6.2 to 6.5, and you're at 5.9.
All right. Well, definitely will be adding more lime then.
Maybe I could ask a follow-up question
Okay.
about testing soils that are formed from actual rocks versus testing soils that people have created from compost. Maybe it's a spent mushroom compost, which is very common around my area here. What kind of soil testing should you do? And like, do you have to have the same set of recommendations for just organic soils?
Um, Organic soils are certain, they open up a whole new avenue of things that are going on. Um, your compost, you can test compost and you get a test for the basic, so you can get compost tested for all those things that you can get a soil test for. And I suspect you can do the same thing with these other constructed soils, and having, at least at first, getting a good soil test, just a standard soil test on those, will give you a starting point. Um, Sometimes some of these others, especially you're talking about a mushroom fungi type compost, that's probably got a tendency to be a little acidic. And now, if you're growing azaleas, fantastic, because they love acidic soils, uh, or blueberries. So there's plants have preferences too.
Maybe I could show you one of those soil tests.
Sure thing.
All right, it should be up on the screen right now.
There it is.
So this was the ammonium acetate version of the soil test.
Right.
Just because I thought there might have been free calcium hanging out in there, I didn't want it to mess up the results necessarily.
Sure. Well, uh, I have my lab run the Melic 3 analysis, which is one of the extractants, and it's a multi-nutrient extractant. Avoid some of those things that you were talking about. You got a higher pH than I would have anticipated. Well, you
Yeah,
don't have any.
usually these like mushroom soil um, tests come out like a super high pH. I find that some of them, most of them don't have enough calcium in there. I see that most of them have a lot of sodium. And so, like, what's going on here is that all the
Well,
mushroom.
what's the okay? So what? How do you make them?
So
I'm not
this
from.
is like soil that mushrooms have been produced in, and this is like the waste product. And so what they're doing is mixing together straw and horse manure and dosing it, I think, with a little bit of lime and then composting it. And then it goes into the mushroom facility. They grow a bunch of mushrooms, and then this is the waste product.
And then so the lime is the reason that the pH is high. Since they use that in the and see, I don't call that stuff that they start with. I've seen those mushroom log things. I saw them in China. That's my only experience looking at those. But yeah, they basically did the same thing. They used some sort of manure, they used straw, and they probably used some lime, and then they grew the mushrooms in those. Um, but that's why the calcium would be high in that one because and the pH high because they start with uh, calcium in the mix. The exchange capacity is well, yeah.
It's like sort of low compared to what I was thinking. And
Well, that's kind of what I was trying to work through, but you're
I noticed that the potassium level is gigantic here, though. I definitely noticed that.
and so that's yeah, that's which is not going to hurt anything. Um, but that's result probably of the manure uh, that they used that would be probably high in potassium. And potassium is soluble. It's the first thing that you lose if you stack something up for a long time. Um, and maybe somehow or another, the mushrooms are concentrating it, getting rid of other stuff. But the others, I noticed that there's no exchangeable hydrogen, and that's kind of what you'd expect when you get a pH that high.
Yeah. That's a little bit concerning whenever you try to add, I think, too much of this to your garden area, is that you really have a high pH and you don't have a good balance here. So the first
Yeah,
year that I had grown in this, um, I didn't do anything to it. I didn't add any minerals or anything like that. The plants did not look very good. Second year, this year, um, I did something that is not like me. I didn't make calculations. I just added a handful of ag lime to like the base around every plant, mixed it up, and then I've just been supplementing some kind of liquid nutrients, and things are looking a lot better this year. I'm looking to test it again though soon.
that one thing okay, there it is. Uh, yeah, the sulfur is really high. Interesting. Um,
Yeah, super high sulfur, strangely.
the I was considering suggesting that you add some sulfur to lower your pH, but never mind.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think just
the
time and rainfall is going to take care of it for me,
Yeah,
probably.
it will. The other thing that is slightly concerning to me down there at the very bottom is the electrical conductivity.
Hmm.
Now that's never that's not done in the way that we do when we're really trying to determine if soils are problematic. But when your electrical conductivity starts going up, that means your salts are there's more salts, soluble salts in the soil, and salts compete with plants for water. Now, if you're a little bit sadistic. Well, you've probably noticed that if you got salt, you're sweating, sweat's got a lot of salt in it, it gets in your eyes and it burns. You have a scratch or cut, uh, you get salt in it and it burns. What's happening is the salt is sucking water out of that stuff.
Hmm.
And so it burns when the salt tries to suck water out of your eye. It burns when the salt is sucking the water out of the cells around that scratch. Well, if you're a little bit sadistic, uh, pack a slug in salt and watch what happens. And it's kind of the same idea that the salt can pull water away from the plants and limit the amount of water that's available. So I'd keep an eye on the electrical conductivity. Uh,
Absolutely. And
then where's your
maybe we could
sodium?
maybe we could talk about the difference between like nutrients that are adsorbed onto clay particles versus nutrients that are just available as like a salt or just maybe even like a free ion, which is maybe not very common in the soil solution, but
Well, actually, you're hitting on the right ideas. So all nutrients are salts. I think because they're all ions. And now what happens when they're soluble salts? So when your fertilizer, uh, you had your potassium sulfate, maybe. Well, what's that? That's an anion and a cation. You put them in the soil and they're soluble, so they split up. You have a ammonium nitrate fertilizer. Don't have a lot of that available anymore. Uh, but an ammonium is a cation, a nitrate is an anion. You put them in the soil, and that fertilizer dissolves. And so all the nutrients that the plants are taking up, they're taking them up as an ion, um, either an anion or a cation. Because once you put them in the soil and they're in that soil solution, they no longer. Uh, Now, there's some things that when you put them in there, if their concentrations right, they'll precipitate, so they'll go out. But when they form a solid again, they're no longer soluble, so they're not available for the plant to take them up. Now, I talked around that. Did I answer your question?
I think so. I think so. And so like my whole thing is what if I, shrunk myself down to the size of a clay particle and I was watching, what was going on in the soil with these plant roots. What kinds of things would I see? And I'm
Well,
just thinking like,
you're going to see calcium, magnesium, potassium, uh, possibly sodium, iron, manganese, copper, and zinc. Hopefully not aluminum. And some ammonium. You're going to see those compounds or ions adsorbed to those clay particles, because those are the cations. Or hydrogen. You might see some hydrogen on those too. Those are the cations. Those are the ones that hook onto the clay particles.
and really
And
it's just the edges of the clay particles, right? That have that negative charge.
mm,
Or
effectively, I'll say it that way, effectively. Um, because I don't want to go into the whole clay clay mineralogy, how the clays are formed, but uh, think about a magnet, and things will hold on to the outside of a magnet. Now, if I if I wrap my magnet in something and have layers and layers of stuff around that, then it's possible that the charge of the magnet will still uh, pick up paper clips. Well, it's the same kind of thing that's going on in the soil. Some of those charged areas are right on the surface of the particle, and so they hook on really strongly. Now, some of them, that uh, charged spot is actually inside the particle, inside that clay structure a little bit, so its charge isn't quite as strong. It's dispersed over a larger area, but it's still uh, uh, effectively what it looks like is that the that cation is adsorbed to the surface of the clay particle. The cation is not interacting directly with anything inside the particle, and and it's not even uh, and it's not a any sort of bond that's going on there. So the using the magnet analogy is probably the closest thing to really uh, get an idea of what's happening there, because ions are charged particles, a magnet's charged, it holds on to things that have the charge that's different from it. And clay particles have a negative charge, which is why those cations I listed earlier are the ones that adsorb to the clay particles. Now, if you get a whole thick layer of cations adsorbed to the outside of a clay particle, you might get enough of a swarm of positive charges out there that they'll hold on a little bit more weakly to some anions like chloride and phosphates.
Hmm. Yeah, that's something that kills me about looking at this soil test with my mushroom compost, is that there's probably not many clay particles in there. And so thinking about like what are these nutrients bonding to? Well, it
The
just
organic matter.
yeah, it must be something with this
Yeah,
organic.
organic matter also has cation exchange capacity.
Hmm. It can also
So
hold on to the negatively charged.
and it yeah, so it's going to hold on to a lot of cations. Um, it it'll also potentially have some positively charged things on the end of it, especially with a pH. Um, Let me think through my stuff here. Lower pHs are the ones that tend to generate some negative, uh,
Royce, can you unshare your screen?
some anion exchange capacity. Um, but yeah, it it's the organic matter. Soils that are high in organic matter are going to hold on to a lot of nutrients because it's the charges that are going on there. And so when you have a higher pH soil, what you end up with is more negative charges around the end of those. So now then we have to talk about organic chemistry just for a minute. Uh, you get these long chains of or rings of carbon, and on the outside of those, they have functional groups or radicals. And so, it can be maybe a nitrate or a hydroxyl or a carboxyl. So there's just all these things that are hooked onto that carbon chain. And on the outside of all of them, really at the end, is usually a hydrogen.
Hmm.
But when you raise the pH, you end up with a whole lot of hydroxyls, which are anions, and they'll start to attract some of those hydrides off of those compounds. And so and they make water. Um,
Wow, it's craziness.
and so that's one. And then, well, two thoughts here. One of them is I make dirt shirts, and when I use soil, typically red soils. I'll use other colors when I sometime, but red works the best. I'll use a red soil to dye a white shirt. Now, why does that work? Well, that cellulose is that long chain and some ring uh, carbon compounds, and they've got all those functional groups out or radicals out there that have some hydrogens at the end. And now I'm going to put it into an iron solution, an iron slurry. And the iron is a stronger cation. Well, it's not a weaker cation to start with, but when you put so many of them in there, they can bully the hydrogens off of the edges of those cellulose molecules, and then the hydrogen hooks onto it and forms a covalent bond, and then they're permanently red. The shirt will never be white again. So the that's why when you go into one of those red places and you wear your white socks, your socks are never going to be white again. Bleach doesn't do it. The Anyway, that's so it's the organic chemistry and the things that are going on there. Uh, the organic matter is what is holding on to all those nutrients.
Hmm. That is interesting. I had no idea that's how it worked in organic matter. So I think that's going to help a lot of people think about it for sure.
Yeah, and again, it's soil science can be very complex because now I have a PhD in soil science, uh, but I also changed my major 5 times. I graduated on my fifth major in undergrad. Uh, so I've had an introductory crop science class, a botany class, a zoology class, had organic chemistry. And so 2 semesters of chemistry. I had organic chemistry. I had 2 semesters of physics. So I had all this stuff coming up. And then I took my crop science classes and crop physiology and breeding and I just kept building that. And then I went to work on my PhD, and it's like, well, hey, you need to take some more chemistry. And so I've had a whole lot of chemistry. I've had a whole lot of, and then uh, soil physics. In the soil engineering class was essentially a physics class, and I had 2 graduate level soil physics classes. Uh, and so I can talk about a whole lot of stuff, uh, and I don't expect anybody to be able to follow all of that. Oh, and then soil chemistry and soil fertility, yeah, all of that. So, you know, so I don't expect anybody to be able to follow all that, but I also try and take everything down to the language that people can understand without sacrificing science. Now, you early on you mentioned some stuff. My brother-in-law uh, is a particle physicist. And so we have some really crazy conversations. My wife and sister-in-law get really annoyed and they'll just go into the other room because they think we're really weird. But he talks about things on the, not on the cellular level, but on the atomic level.
Mhm.
And so as we talk about these things, he understands things that are going on there, and then I explain something that's happening. And so what we see is that I help him understand the macro scale of what he's seeing on this subatomic scale. So it's a lot of fun when we talk about forces and van der Waals and types of bonds and all those kinds of things. We both talk about a weak force, but we don't mean the same thing. So we have to figure out how that what's uh, the but there's a lot of fun that you can have uh, when you talk with somebody else, even if your science discipline isn't the same, because you begin to see, again, for him, now he's got ideas to talk to his students about when they say, well, why is this important? He can say, well,
Now, that's a
Yeah,
conversation that I would love to hear sometime
same.
because I had gotten just briefly into like the van der Waals radius and things like that about why, particles are attracted to other ones. And that is it just blows my mind that everything works like that in the soil. But
but you know,
no one thinks about it. They think
so,
it's only dirt.
sodium is a problem that you do start dealing with these forces that we're talking about, because then you get to something talking about the hydrated size. Okay, right? Because the water forms a shell around the particle. Well, something weird about sodium, and it's because it has a low charge density. It's a relatively large ion to only have one to be monovalent cation. Calcium's a bigger ion, but it's divalent, so it can hold things in a little stronger. Potassium's bigger, but it has a different way that it acts. So anyway, the sodium allows that shell of water to be bigger. And because it's bigger, it can actually keep soil particles far enough apart that that cohesion doesn't work anymore. Um, which is why sodium is used as in a detergent,
Hmm.
because we call it dispersing. It forms this large shell, helps lift it keeps particles from sticking to stuff, and helps them come off of your plate when you're washing it or off of your hands. But in the soil, that shell is large enough that it can push soil particles far enough apart that the cohesion in those clay particles doesn't work anymore. And so then that's why the soil particles disperse and you can get crusting with sodium as a problem.
Dr. Dirt, is there one thing that made you like fall out of your chair? Or I'm sorry, like what is one thing that made you like fall out of your chair just out of shock for like learning about soil?
Well, one of the first ones was just when I had that epiphany about what a water table was.
Hmm.
Uh, I I didn't understand it. I talked about it. I didn't have any frame of reference to put on. So that was one of them when uh, oh wow, almost fell off my bike. Uh, because I'm looking back trying to figure out, where's the hose? So those kind of that was one of the biggest epiphany moments for me. Um, See if I can think of anything else. Well, uh, the one thing that I say that really shocks people, and I use it partially for shock value, but is if you hate your soil, till it, plow it, because plowing is the absolutely worst thing that you can do for a soil. You destroy the soil structure. Um, you burn up carbon, so you reduce the amount of carbon in the soil, and then that means that your soil is going to lose structure again. You destroy the structure by tearing all the aggregates apart. Then, because of what you've done there, organisms have now more surface area and oxygen, and so they go to work munching all the organic carbon that was in that soil. And now you've got less carbon, so now the soil structure degrades even more. Uh, Plus, you burn out some other nutrients. So tillage is the absolute worst thing that you can do to a soil. It burns it out faster than anything else. And so that's one of the things that I think is a uh, an aha moment for people, and they they almost call me a liar. But I've told you that there was a long time ago that Jethro Tull wrote that. I have a John Deere handbook from 1945, and it still talks about pulverizing the soil uh, and
Hmm.
and to create these conditions that we know now are sometimes the way that they worded their wording was they're mutually exclusive. You can't create something that's compacted and have plenty of airspace. That doesn't work, but that's the wording that they're using. And they're thinking that's what happens when they pulverize the soil.
Hmm.
Uh, so that's one of the ahas that I try to encourage other people to have. Now, does that mean you should never till the soil? If you can get away with it, don't till the soil. But there are soils that you can't get away with it because maybe they're too sandy and you have to do some deep tillage to pull up some clay from below to help them have a little bit of structural stability. The But every time you do that, you reset the clock to zero. And so it starts rebuilding things all over again. Uh,
And how would you like, so if tilling's so bad, how would you amend your soil? So for instance, I have to add lime to my soil to raise the pH and get the calcium up without wanting to disturb my precious soil. What is the best way to do that?
well, um, are you are you just putting it on your lawn? If you're putting it on your lawn, just spread it because the water's gonna you guys get plenty of rainfall out there, and it'll wash in. It'll soak in. Now, it's not a fast process. Uh, Same for fertilizers. If you're going to use a fertilizer, put it out. Compost is a little more challenging, but you can put your compost on the surface and organisms will begin to decompose it and it will begin to move into the soil. Um, yeah, that's one of the questions that people will ask when I'm talking to farmers. What do you do? Well, if you can do it, inject the fertilizer. So you put it down into the soil, maybe in a little trench instead of disturbing everything. Um, my shortgrass prairie, I I do what I'll call a zone tillage. I lay out a drip line, and it's got a dripper every foot or every 2 foot, and I'll run it for a little bit, and I'll see where those drips are, where those emitters are, and then I'll dig a little hole on either side of it. I've got something called a weasel, and I put a little bit of compost and a little bit of fertilizer, and I plant a hole. I plant a seed in those.
Thank you so much for listening. I'm sorry we're going to have to cut this a little abruptly. We lost some power, but the video was ending anyway, and it was a pleasure to have Clay Robinson on here. And if you want to go check him out, please go follow him on his website, drdirt.org. That's DOCTORDIRT.org. His YouTube at Dr. Dirt Soil Videos, or his Instagram at CDRDIRT. Thank you. Have a great growing season.